is really focused on general state workforces. Later today I'll be speaking more specifically about what's happening with corrections officer contracts. But across all 6 of our neighboring states, while each jurisdiction has its own fiscal factors, its own economic considerations and timing issues, all of them, to varying degrees, are struggling with significant fiscal challenges and have adopted significant workforce cost containment. In Delaware, just to our south, in 2010 there was actually a wage reduction for state employees, and while that reduction has now abated, pay ranges are still at the levels set in fiscal 2009, and at the same time employee pension contributions are increasing, employee health care contributions are increasing due to cost containment legislatively enacted. In Maryland, the state government has implemented step freezes, temporary salary reductions, and furlough days for both 2010 and 2011. Salary reductions equivalent to 3 to 5 days of pay, and with the latest collective bargaining agreement going into effect there will be a continued step freeze through 2012. There are some wage increases the state is hoping to provide in the out years of that agreement, but they're contingent within the agreement on revenue growth, and at the same time the state is ratcheting up employee pension contributions for most of their civilian workforce. In New Jersey, during the course of this recession, an existing contract was reopened to defer a scheduled wage increase and implement furlough days, and while negotiations are still ongoing for prospective agreement terms, the governor there is proposing significant increases in employee pension contributions and increasing state worker health care contributions to 30% of premiums. And that's an ongoing debate in their state legislature. In New York State, the primary settlement pattern across New York was reached before the recession really hit full force. In the first agreement covering law enforcement officers such as park police and university police in New York, as that pre-recession pattern ends and as new terms are put into place going forward for 2012, 13, and 14, the state law enforcement officers union agreed to a 3-year pay freeze, no step increases for 2013 or 2014, and an increase in employee health care contributions to 35% of premium for dependent coverage and 20% for single coverage. In Ohio, by agreement with the state's largest union, from 2009 through February 2012, there's a 3-year wage freeze, 2-year step freeze, 20 unpaid furlough days, reductions in personal leave, and legislative proposals to increase employee pension contributions. And in West Virginia, where things tend to happen year to year, there's not a unionized workforce. There's currently a wage and step freeze in effect. So again, different experiences, different factors, but a common theme, as seen nationally, focus on cost containment to address the kind of fiscal pressures that are still being felt. Turning to slide 22, this refers back to the Federal Government Accountability Office GAO study that I referenced earlier. The GAO has developed a simulation model looking at state and local government finances as a sector in the aggregate and forecasting out, if no changes are made, what are revenues going to look like, what are expenditure pressures going to do. And because of revenues, again, barely keeping pace with economic output, while healthcare costs and retiree costs continue to rise, They're projecting that without corrective action, there's an underlying structural challenge facing the state and local sector for at least the next 60 years. So there is this recessionary hangover, the lingering effects of the downturn and its severity over the past several years, but that's layered over and above some very real structural challenges estimated by the GAO to be equivalent to about 12.5% of total expenditures as a gap that needs to be closed in the years ahead. An ongoing pressure that remains with us even as we continue to struggle with the shorter term challenges. So just to sum up, there are some positive signs. I hope they continue, but it's going to take significant time for those to translate into real budgetary relief, and again, because of these structural factors, it's not going to be sufficient based on any kind of current projections to grow the states out their fiscal challenges. It's going to take years, as the quote from another Pew study reads, for states to return to normal, whatever the new normal will be, and short-run solutions won't solve the problem.
Thank you, sir. Does the association have any questions for Mr. Nadal?
Yes.
Mr. Nadal, excuse me. My name is Attorney Todd Egan, and I'm an attorney for the Pennsylvania State Corrections Officers Association. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. If at any time you don't understand the question or you wish that I clarify the question, just ask me to do so, and I'd be happy to. If I don't hear you ask for me to clarify the question, I'm going to assume that you understand it fully. Is that okay?
Good morning. I'll be with us.
Okay. Now, this is not, as Arbitrator Welby mentioned, this is not the first time that you've testified on behalf of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And in fact, this is not the first time you've testified at a proceeding between the Commonwealth and the Pennsylvania State Correction Officers Association, correct?
That's also correct.
All right. In fact, in April of 2008, you testified on behalf of the Commonwealth in an interest arbitration proceeding with the correctional officers. Do you recall that?
In general terms, I do.
Okay. And at that time, you gave a similar presentation on the state of the states. Do you recall that?
I recall addressing some of the same issues, yes.
Okay. And during that testimony, you also talked about all of the major economic indicators showing a negative economy and that the economy had drastically turned sharply downward. Do you recall giving that type of presentation?
In general terms, I do. April 2008 was the period when we would subsequently be determined to have fallen within the start of the recession. The recession began in December 2007. The way the recessions are dated by the economists group, the National Bureau of Economic Research, that dates business cycles, we didn't actually know yet for sure that we were in a recession, and I did cover in my testimony some of the concerns that indeed that is what was happening, and as it turned out, that's what it was.
Okay. Now, in addition to that testimony in April of 2008, you also testified in October of 2008 in a proceeding between the Commonwealth and the Pennsylvania State Troopers Association. Do you recall giving that presentation?
In general terms.
Okay. And during that presentation, you used the term economic downturn at that time. Do you remember giving that presentation in general?
In general, I do.
All right. Now, back in August of 2007, you also testified on behalf of the Commonwealth in a proceeding between the Commonwealth and the Pennsylvania State Rangers Association. Do you recall that presentation?
Not in any detail, but I recall that I would have testified.
Okay.
At that juncture.
would it be fair to say that in August of 2007, you also, your presentation presented the economy in a negative manner at that point in time? The state of the economy being in a negative condition?
The state of the economy at that time was in a negative condition.
Okay. And then also in June of 2007, you testified in a proceeding between the Commonwealth and the Capitol Police. Do you recall that proceeding?
Again, not in any detail, but I do recall testifying.
Okay. And can we agree that in June of 2007 in the Capitol Police proceeding, you also gave an opinion that the economy was in a negative state at that point?
I think in that period, my testimony focused more on some of the same type of structural challenges that I outlined today, but some of the weakening of the economy was starting to present itself by that point. Okay.
Now, let's even go further back. In June of 2005, you also testified on behalf of the Commonwealth in a proceeding between the Commonwealth and, again, the correctional officers. Do you remember that presentation that you gave?
Not in as much detail.
Okay.
I do recall testifying.
Now, in that proceeding in June of 2005, you also quoted Moody's. Is that something that you referred to on a regular basis?
I do. The rating agencies are independent perspective on fiscal condition for public sector entities. Sure.
And in June of 2005, the previous correctional officer's presentation, you also presented the state of the economy as being negative, or however you want, you know, in a negative condition at that point, correct?
Again, I haven't reviewed that testimony in detail. My general recollection is that in that period, the focus of my testimony would have been more on some of the structural challenges facing state governments as opposed to the kind of acute effects from the more severe recessionary period that followed.
All right. And prior to that, in 2004, you also presented testimony on behalf of the Commonwealth in a proceeding, again, with the Pennsylvania State Troopers Association. Do you recall that arbitration that you were involved in?
Again, in general terms.
All right. And you, on cross-examination, had referred to the economy at that point as, or the factors that were contributing to the negative economic downturn at that time as the perfect storm. Do you remember that testimony?
I remember generally testifying in the aftermath of the 2002 recession, 2001, 2002 recessionary period, about the confluence of factors that were hitting state budgets. I think the perfect storm reference was quoted from one of the, perhaps the National Governors Association or one of the governors in office at that time. It wasn't a phrase that I coined, but I think it did capture, again, the confluence of many of the same factors I talked about today coming out of that prior recession, the first of the two that colored so much of the past decade in that earlier period.
So by my calculations, at least the presentations that I've been unable to uncover, if we include today's, I've just basically talked about 7 different presentations that you've made on behalf of the Commonwealth. Is that correct? At least in what I've uncovered.
I'll accept that. I wasn't tallying
the
number.
And in all 7 of those presentations, is it fair to say that based upon what we just talked about, in all 7 presentations, your opinion in regard to the economy was that it was in a negative state?
In the majority of those cases, the economy was clearly in a negative state.